Grace Reynolds stood frozen in the doorway of the upscale restaurant, clutching her purse like a shield. This was why she never agreed to blind dates: the anxiety, the awkward small talk, the inevitable disappointment. But her roommate Mia had been relentless. "Just one date," she'd pleaded. "He's perfect for you." Now, scanning the sea of white tablecloths and crystal glasses, Grace wondered which of these strangers was about to judge her choice of outfit and conversation skills. "Miss Reynolds," the hostess appeared beside her, "your party is already seated. This way, please." Grace followed on shaky legs, mentally rehearsing her emergency exit strategy: fake phone call, sudden illness, spontaneous combustion. When the hostess stopped at a corner table, Grace's breath caught. The man who stood to greet her wasn't at all what she'd expected. "Grace, I'm Zachary Morrison." His voice was deep, his smile genuine. Tall with broad shoulders, he had dark hair with just a hint of silver at the temples and eyes that crinkled warmly at the corners when he smiled. "Hi," Grace managed, accepting his handshake. His palm was warm and firm against hers. "Nice to meet you." As she slid into her seat, she noticed how he waited until she was settled before sitting down himself. Old-fashioned manners. Interesting. "I hope you haven't been waiting long," Grace said, unfolding her napkin. "Not at all," Zachary replied. "I've been enjoying the view." His eyes held hers for a beat longer than necessary, and Grace felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, like standing too close to a fire. The waiter appeared with water and wine menus. Zachary deferred to her preference with an easy confidence that spoke of a man accustomed to fine dining but not showy about it. "So," Grace began after they'd ordered, "what did Mia tell you about me?" Zachary laughed, a rich sound that seemed to warm the space between them. "That you're brilliant, kind, and criminally underappreciated at your job." Grace rolled her eyes. "She's biased. We've been friends since college." "She also said you'd be modest," Zachary countered. "Tell me about this criminally underappreciated job." "I'm an architectural preservationist. I work for the City Historical Society, evaluating buildings for historical significance and restoration potential." She paused. "It's not as boring as it sounds, I promise." "I don't think it sounds boring at all," Zachary said, leaning forward slightly. "You're literally preserving history." Grace blinked in surprise. Most people's eyes glazed over when she mentioned her work. "What about you?" she asked. "What do you do?" Something flickered across his face: hesitation. "I'm in construction and development," he said simply. "That's vague," Grace laughed. "What kind of development?" "Various projects, commercial, some residential." He shrugged. "Nothing as interesting as saving historical buildings." Grace narrowed her eyes playfully. "Are you one of those developers who bulldozes historic neighborhoods to build luxury condos? Because that might make this a very short date." Zachary laughed, holding up his hands in surrender. "I plead the fifth, but I will say I have a deep appreciation for architecture with character and history." Their conversation flowed easily from there. Zachary asked thoughtful questions about her work, and Grace found herself animatedly describing the 1920s theater she was fighting to save from demolition. He listened with genuine interest, asking about architectural details that revealed a surprisingly sophisticated knowledge. By the time their entrees arrived, Grace had nearly forgotten they were strangers. There was something about Zachary that felt comfortable. Not in a boring way, but in the way a perfectly tailored coat fits, as if the conversation had been made just for them. "So no family in the city?" Zachary asked, refilling her wine glass. Grace shook her head. "My parents are in Oregon. Dad's a retired park ranger. Mom teaches elementary school. I'm their only child, so they'd love for me to move back. But you love the city," Zachary finished for her. "I do. The energy, the history. Every building tells a story." She paused. "What about you? Family here?" A shadow crossed his face. "My parents passed away years ago. I have a younger sister in Boston. We're close but don't see each other enough." Grace touched his hand briefly. "I'm sorry about your parents." He turned his palm up, catching her fingers for just a moment. "Thank you. It was a long time ago, but you never really stop missing them, do you? The vulnerability in his eyes made something shift in Grace's chest. This wasn't the superficial back and forth she'd expected from a blind date. This felt real. When the check arrived, Zachary reached for it smoothly. Grace started to protest, but he shook his head. "Please, I invited you." "Actually, Mia invited both of us," Grace corrected with a smile. "Then let me thank her by making sure her friend has a good evening." His eyes held a question. "Speaking of which, the night is still young. Would you like to walk for a bit? There's a place nearby with the best desserts in the city." Grace hesitated only briefly. Every instinct told her to say yes. "I'd like that." Outside, the early autumn air was crisp. Zachary offered his jacket when he noticed her shiver, draping it gently over her shoulders. It carried his scent, something woodsy and expensive. They strolled along the river, the city lights reflecting on the water. Grace found herself telling him about the restoration project that had brought her to the city 3 years ago, the Victorian-era post office that had been slated for demolition. "I've seen that building," Zachary said. "The renovation is remarkable. That was your project," Grace nodded proudly. "My first major win. The developers wanted to tear it down for a high rise, but we proved its historical value and found a compromise." Zachary was quiet for a moment. "The Morrison building, right? On 7th and Grand." Grace stopped walking, turning to face him. "Yes, how did you know that?" Something shifted in his expression. "Because I was the developer who wanted to tear it down." The world seemed to tilt slightly under Grace's feet. "You're that Morrison?" Zachary nodded, watching her carefully. "Morrison Development. I'm the CEO." Grace's mind raced. Morrison Development was one of the largest commercial real estate companies in the region. They were known for luxury properties, massive urban renewal projects, and fighting with preservationists like her. "You failed to mention that detail over dinner," she said, her voice cooling. "I wanted you to get to know me as a person first, not as a CEO or whatever preconceptions might come with that." He ran a hand through his hair. "For what it's worth, that post office project changed how I approach historic properties. Your presentation to the board was enlightening." Grace frowned. "You were at that meeting?" "I don't remember seeing you." "Back row. I prefer to let my team handle the public-facing aspects." He paused. "But I remember you. You were passionate, prepared, and completely right about the building's potential." Grace wasn't sure how to process this information. On one hand, she'd spent years viewing developers like Morrison as adversaries. On the other hand, the man standing before her was nothing like the soulless corporate raider she'd imagined. "So all those questions about preservation, you were just humoring me?" "No," Zachary said firmly. "I was genuinely interested in your perspective. That project opened my eyes to what's possible when development and preservation work together instead of against each other." Grace studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity but finding none. "I need to process this." "I understand," he said, disappointment evident in his voice. "I should have been upfront from the beginning. I apologize for that." They walked back toward the restaurant in awkward silence. When they reached her car, Zachary handed her a business card. "In case you ever want to continue our conversation," he said simply. "No pressure." Grace took the card, noticing the embossed Morrison Development logo she'd seen on construction sites across the city. "Thank you for dinner," she said formally. "Thank you for your company," he replied, stepping back. "Good night, Grace." As she drove home, Grace's mind whirled with conflicting thoughts. The evening had been perfect until that revelation, but was it really such a deal-breaker? People were more than their jobs, after all. And he had seemed genuinely interested in her work, had even admitted she'd changed his perspective. By the time she reached her apartment, curiosity had overtaken indignation. She Googled Zachary Morrison CEO and was immediately flooded with results. Business Journal profiles. Charity gala photos. A Forbes 40 Under 40 feature from several years ago. The man she'd just had dinner with was worth millions. But what caught her attention was a recent interview about Morrison Development's new restoration initiative, where historic buildings were being repurposed, rather than demolished. The article quoted Zachary. "We found that preserving architectural heritage while adapting spaces for modern use creates more value than starting from scratch. It's good for business, good for the community, and good for the soul of the city." The interview was dated 6 months after the post office project. Grace set her phone down, unsure what to think. Maybe he had been telling the truth about her influence, and maybe she'd overreacted. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mia. "How was IT?" Grace stared at the screen, then typed, "It's complicated, call you tomorrow." The next morning, Grace arrived at work to find her office buzzing with excitement. Her boss, Eleanor, waved her over immediately. "Grace, thank goodness you're here. You're not going to believe this." "What's happening?" Grace asked, setting down her coffee. "Morrison Development has withdrawn their demolition application for the Harrington Theater." Grace froze. The Harrington was her current project, a stunning Art Deco theater that had been dark for decades. Morrison had purchased it 6 months ago with plans to replace it with luxury apartments. Grace and her team had been fighting the demolition, but with the property already sold, their options were limited. Withdrawn? Why? Eleanor handed her an official letter. "They're proposing a joint restoration project instead, converting it to a performing arts center with residential space in the adjoining lot. They specifically requested our office's collaboration, with you as lead consultant." Grace stared at the letter, her heart pounding as she recognized the signature at the bottom. "Zachary Morrison, this is unexpected," she managed. "It's a miracle is what it is," Eleanor said. "Morrison never compromises like this. Something must have changed his mind." Grace nodded absently, thinking of their dinner conversation about the theater. She described its marble staircases and hand-painted ceiling murals with such passion. Had that really influenced a multi-million-dollar business decision overnight? When she reached her desk, there was a small package waiting. Inside was a book, a rare edition on Art Deco theaters, and a note card that simply read, "I'm listening now. Z, no pressure, no grand gestures, just a professional olive branch that acknowledged her expertise." It was, Grace had to admit, the perfect response. She hesitated only briefly before texting the number on his business card. "Thank you for the book, and for reconsidering the Harrington." His reply came quickly. "Thank you for opening my eyes. Would you be willing to meet to discuss the project?" Professionally, of course, Grace smiled to herself. "I think that could be arranged." Their meeting was scheduled at the theater itself. Grace arrived early, clipboard in hand, prepared to be all business. When Zachary arrived, he was similarly professional, suit and tie, accompanied by his project manager and architect. "Miss Reynolds, thank you for agreeing to consult," he said formally, though his eyes held a warmth that was just for her. "Mr. Morrison, I'm glad we found room for compromise." They spent the next 2 hours touring the decaying theater, with Grace pointing out original features worth saving and suggesting restoration approaches. Zachary asked intelligent questions and took notes. His team seemed surprised by his detailed interest. This clearly wasn't his usual approach. When the others stepped away to examine the projection room, Zachary turned to Grace. "I'm sorry about how we left things the other night," he said quietly. "I should have been honest from the start." Grace nodded. "Yes, you should have, but—" "This," she gestured around the theater, "speaks volumes. I meant what I said about your influence. After that post office project, I started looking differently at properties like this. The numbers actually support preservation when done right." He paused. "But I might have fast-tracked this particular decision after meeting you." A small smile tugged at Grace's lips. "Is that your way of asking for a second date, Mr. Morrison? Would it be inappropriate, given our professional connection now?" Grace considered this. "Perhaps we should keep things strictly professional until this project is completed." Disappointment flickered across his face, but he nodded. "I respect that. However," Grace continued, "the project won't be finished for at least 6 months. "That's a long time," Zachary agreed, a hopeful note entering his voice. So maybe we could meet occasionally to discuss architectural theory in a purely educational capacity. The corner of his mouth lifted. I do have a lot to learn, exactly, for the good of future projects. For the good of the city, he agreed solemnly, though his eyes were laughing. Their educational discussions began the following week. They met at a quiet cafe near the Historical Society offices, where Zachary arrived with a stack of books on architectural preservation that he'd clearly been studying. Homework, Grace asked, amused. Research, he corrected. I like to be thorough. Over the next month, these meetings became a regular occurrence. They would start with genuine discussions about architecture and preservation, which would inevitably drift into personal conversations. Grace learned about Zachary's difficult childhood, losing his father young, working construction jobs through college to help support his mother and sister, building his company from nothing. Zachary, in turn, listened raptly to Grace's stories of growing up in a small town, discovering her passion for old buildings during family road trips to historic sites, and fighting for her career in a field often dominated by men with architectural degrees rather than preservation specialists like herself. You know, he said during one of their coffee meetings, I used to think preservationists were just obstacles people who said no to progress without understanding the economic realities. And I thought developers were all greedy destroyers who couldn't see past their profit margins, Grace admitted. We were both right sometimes, Zachary said thoughtfully, but mostly wrong. As autumn deepened into winter, their meetings extended beyond coffee. They visited architectural exhibits together, toured historical buildings, and once spent an entire Saturday exploring a salvage yard where Zachary purchased period-appropriate fixtures for the Harrington restoration. Through it all, they maintained the pretense that these were professional encounters, even as Grace found herself dressing more carefully on days they were meeting, even as Zachary's hand occasionally brushed hers in ways that seemed far from accidental. The Harrington project progressed rapidly. Grace was impressed by how Zachary had embraced the restoration, investing in authentic materials and craftsmanship beyond what was strictly necessary. His team had stopped looking surprised at his involvement and now sought Grace's input directly. Your influence on him is the best thing that's happened to this company in years, his project manager confided to Grace one day. He's always been brilliant at the business side, but now there's heart in what we're doing. Grace tried to ignore the warmth that spread through her chest at these words. She was becoming increasingly aware that her feelings for Zachary had evolved far beyond professional admiration or even friendship. But their agreement stood nothing personal until the project was complete. 3 months into the restoration, disaster struck. During the removal of later additions to the theater's lobby, workers discovered significant structural damage that had been hidden for decades. The cost to repair it properly would add millions to the budget. Grace received an urgent call to come to the site. When she arrived, Zachary was in intense discussion with his team, his expression grim. How bad is it? She asked after examining the damage. Bad, he admitted. The engineers say we need to completely rebuild this section from the foundation up. His project manager looked tense. Mr. Morrison, we need to discuss budget constraints. The board doesn't make these decisions, I do. Zachary's voice was firm. We're proceeding as planned with appropriate structural reinforcement. After the others left, Grace approached him. Zachary, this is a major expense. If you need to scale back some of the other restoration elements, no, he said simply. We're doing this right. He looked at her directly. This building matters. What we're creating here matters. It's just a building, Grace said softly. It's more than that. He stepped closer. This project, it's become something I'm proud of, not just another development but something that honors the past while creating something new. He paused, rather like what's happening between us. Grace's breath caught. It was the first time either of them had directly acknowledged the growing connection between them. Zachary, I know, professional boundaries until completion. He ran a hand through his hair. But that's becoming increasingly difficult. Before Grace could respond, his phone rang an emergency with another project. The moment passed, but something had shifted between them. In the weeks that followed, their educational discussions became charged with unspoken feelings. Zachary's gaze lingered longer. Grace found excuses to stand closer. The pretense of professional distance was wearing thin. Then came the night of the winter storm. Grace had stayed late at the theater, documenting original plasterwork uncovered during the day's work. She was so absorbed that she didn't notice the deteriorating weather until Zachary called. "Where are you?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "The roads are icing over." "Still at the Harrington," Grace admitted. "I lost track of time." "Stay there," he said firmly. "I'm 10 minutes away." "I'll come get you." By the time Zachary arrived, the storm had intensified. Wind howled through the partially restored building and snow swirled through the street outside. "We should wait it out," Zachary decided, looking at the treacherous conditions. "The construction office has heat and a coffee maker. We'll be comfortable enough." The office was a converted storage room with a desk, a small sofa, and a space heater that fought valiantly against the cold. Zachary found emergency blankets in a supply cabinet and handed one to Grace. "Not exactly the Plaza Hotel," he joked, making them each a cup of instant coffee. "I've been in worse situations," Grace said, gratefully accepting the warm mug. "Once I got locked in a condemned Victorian mansion overnight. No heat, no plumbing, and definitely haunted." "Haunted, huh?" Zachary raised an eyebrow. "I wouldn't have pegged you as a believer in ghosts. I'm a preservationist. We're all a little superstitious about old buildings." She sipped her coffee. "They have souls in a way." "Is that why you fight so hard for them?" Grace considered this. "Partly. But it's also about recognizing value that others miss. When most people look at a crumbling old building, they see problems, expenses, limitations. I see possibilities and stories. That's how I've come to see them too," Zachary admitted, "because of you." The small room suddenly felt even smaller. Grace was acutely aware of how close they sat on the narrow sofa, sharing blankets and warmth. "Zachary," she began cautiously, "I think we should talk about what's happening between us." "I thought we weren't discussing that until the project was complete," he reminded her, though his eyes said something entirely different. "Well, we're currently trapped in a snowstorm in a half-restored theater. I think special circumstances apply." Zachary laughed softly. "Fair enough." He set his mug down and turned toward her. "Grace Reynolds, I am completely, thoroughly falling for you. Have been since you lectured me about Art Deco ornamentation on our third coffee meeting." Grace's heart pounded. "That was a very dry lecture on decorative plasterwork." "It was the most fascinating conversation I'd ever had because it was with you." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I've never met anyone who challenges me the way you do professionally, intellectually, personally. Even when we disagree," she smiled, "especially then." His voice dropped lower. "I think we've been maintaining this professional charade long enough, don't you?" Instead of answering, Grace leaned forward and kissed him. Zachary responded immediately, one hand cupping her face while the other drew her closer. The kiss deepened, months of restrained feelings finally finding expression. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since our first date." "Even after you found out I was the preservationist who thwarted your post office development," Grace teased, "especially then. Your passion was intoxicating." They talked through the night as the storm raged outside, sharing stories and dreams and fears that had remained unspoken during their cautious friendship. Grace told him about her failed engagement years ago to an architect who'd wanted her to give up her career after marriage. Zachary revealed his lingering insecurities from growing up poor in a wealthy community. By morning, when the storm had passed and sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the construction office, they had crossed a threshold from which there was no returning. Professional pretenses had been abandoned. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The Harrington restoration continued through winter into spring. Zachary and Grace no longer pretended their relationship was purely professional, though they maintained appropriate boundaries at work. Their teams adjusted quickly, some even admitting they'd had a betting pool on when the two would finally get together. On a warm evening in May, 6 months after their first date, the Harrington Theatre held its grand reopening gala. The restoration was complete, a stunning blend of historical authenticity and modern function. The theater would host performances while the adjoining building provided affordable housing for artists and arts education spaces. Grace stood in the restored lobby, watching guests in formal attire marvel at the gleaming marble and refurbished chandeliers. Her team had pulled off something miraculous here, and pride swelled in her chest. "Quite a night," Zachary said, appearing beside her in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. "You should be proud. We should be proud," Grace corrected. "This was a true collaboration," he smiled, taking her hand. "I have something to show you before the ceremony starts." He led her through a side door and up a narrow staircase she didn't recognize. "Where are we going? You'll see." They emerged onto the theater's roof, where Zachary had created a small garden with potted plants and twinkling lights. A small table was set for two, with champagne chilling in an ice bucket. "What's all this?" Grace asked, taking in the romantic setting. "I wanted a moment alone with you before we face the crowds." He poured 2 glasses of champagne to celebrate properly. They clinked glasses, looking out over the city skyline as the sun set. "I've been thinking," Zachary said after a moment, "about our next project." "Already planning the next restoration," Grace laughed. "The paint's barely dry on this one." "Not exactly." He set down his glass and took both her hands in his. "I'm thinking of something more personal, a lifetime project, you might say." Grace's heart skipped as he dropped to one knee, producing a small velvet box from his pocket. "Grace Reynolds, meeting you changed everything: my perspective, my priorities, my heart. You taught me to see value in preserving the past while building something new." He opened the box, revealing a vintage ring with a center diamond surrounded by smaller stones. "This was my grandmother's. I had it restored, just like we did with the Harrington." Grace's eyes filled with tears as he continued. "I love you, Grace. Your passion, your principles, your unwavering commitment to what matters. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered, then laughed through her tears. "Absolutely yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Zachary smiled up at her. "I should warn you, I plan to be very involved in this particular restoration project. No delegating to the project manager." Grace pulled him to his feet and into her arms. "I wouldn't have it any other way, Mr. Morrison." They sealed the promise with a kiss as the theater's newly restored lights illuminated below them. A perfect metaphor for what they'd found together: something old made new again, stronger and more beautiful than before. 1 year later, they married in the Harrington Theatre, surrounded by friends, family, and the many people who had worked on the restoration. The theater that had brought them together now witnessed their vows to build a life that honored both tradition and innovation, preservation and growth. As CEO of Morrison Development, Zachary continued to transform his company's approach, establishing a dedicated historical preservation division with Grace as consultant. Together, they created a foundation that funded restoration projects in communities that couldn't afford them, preserving architectural heritage across the region. Their personal renovation project, a crumbling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of the city that everyone had deemed too far gone, became their home and greatest joint achievement. Room by room, they restored it to its former glory while adapting it for modern living, much as they had done with their own lives, honoring the past while building a future together. On their 2nd anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their restored home, Grace rested her head on Zachary's shoulder. "Did you ever imagine that blind date would lead to all this?" she asked. Zachary smiled, his arm tightening around her. "Not specifically. But I knew from the first moment I saw you that you were someone who could change my world." He kissed her softly. And you have, in every way that matters. As the sun set over their home, Grace thought about how sometimes the most beautiful restorations came from the most unexpected beginnings, like a blind date with a CEO who'd soon love her forever.